we're at time. Let's get started. Today, we are honored to host Professor Gail Hershatter, a scholar of the history of modern China, labor history, and gender and sexuality in China. Professor Hershatter's foundational scholarship has shaped the field in ways that hardly require any introduction. We often first come to know Professor Hershatter through her writings, which consistently lead Chinese history reading lists, whether for introduction history classes, oral history guidance, or popular recommendations on Xiaohongshu. At the center of her work lies a sustained inquiry into how history is known and remembered. In a world increasingly saturated with representation and tempted by the comforts of forgetting, Professor Hershatter's scholarship opens a careful framed aperture onto lives we seek to understand. Tianjin workers, Shanghai courtesans, rural women in Shanxi, and Fulian cadres, and women across China's war and revolutions. True to her own onion metaphor, Hershatter doesn't peel the past down in search for a singular historical truth. Instead, she patiently reveals the ideological underpinning and the material texture of each layer, making readers weep along with her masterful culinary art of history. Beyond titles and prizes, Professor Hershatter is known among students and colleagues to be smart and decisive, yet deeply attentive to feelings, subjects, and ethics. At UC Santa Cruz, she has helped build the intellectual home that sustains the field, serving as the chair of history and East Asian studies, leading the Committee on Academic Freedom and Committee on Academic Personnel, co-chairing best practices initiatives, advising the Institute for Humanities Research, and mentoring junior faculty members. In the profession at large, she has shouldered major reviewers and committee roles across history and Asian studies. True to her pedagogy, she also invites us to practice history as care, encouraging students and communities to record oral histories in their own families so that memory and scholarship can sustain each other. On a personal note, many of us at United Proud Women feel a particular warmth and intimacy in Professor Hershatter's work. As we're building this community committed to queer world making and to imagine futures beyond patriarchy, heteronormativity, and oppression, we recognize in her scholarship a companion vision. She honors vivid, situated lives, once deemed unworthy of the record. Her care in recording, archiving, and interpreting those marginal and underrepresented lives prompts our deep gratitude. For all we owe Professor Hershatter, she just keeps turning attention outward. Even in retirement, she pursues new research on legendary Chinese figures and devotes time to her families and communities, rarely centering her own trajectory, experiences, or the life stories that shaped her scholarship and aspirations. Her humility prompts a further question. By what intellectual, institutional, and social conditions is such scholarship of excellence formed and sustained? Accordingly, we offer today's forum both as an expression of gratitude and as a curious inquiry. What would it take to cultivate the rigorous, ephemeral, pedagogical, archival, and communal circumstances that make work like Hershatter's possible? How can our society foster more thoughts and characters of her kind? In pursuing these questions, we aim to complete the circle, allowing both her scholarship and her character to be the guiding stars for our shared future of recognition, mutual support, and women's solidarity. With that, we cede the floor to Professor Hershatter.
Thank you so much, and good morning. There's absolutely no way I could live up to that introduction, so I'm not even going to try. But Thank you very much. That was very, very generous. And, when you're a historian and you write things and they go out into the world, you have no idea what they're doing once they leave you. So it's nice to hear that some of my work has been useful. So I want to thank you, and then thank Yusin and thank United Proud Women, not only for this invitation, but for the exceptionally enthusiastic and inquisitive way the organizers of this group have approached the prospect of my giving a talk. At the same time, I have to say that I found writing this talk quite challenging. I gave it a general title, Chinese Women and the Disappearing Past, but what the organizers have actually asked me to do, as you just heard, is to historicize myself alongside the questions I have spent some decades researching. The list of questions I received from them includes, quote, personal story/motivation, research background and methodology, how one project led to another, obstacles in research, your process of synthesizing knowledge, how you weave theory into your work, and how you have formed a personalized style of writing, as well as the relationship of vision to practice in your historical work, unquote. Very daunting. What I've discovered in the course of thinking about this talk is that I'm quite comfortable thinking about gender in Chinese history, raising questions that might be unanswerable, and doing my best to offer historical analysis. But I'm much less accustomed to thinking about the conditions of my production as a historian. This is not because I have trouble regarding myself as a historical artifact. I am certainly old enough to have earned that label. It's more that I have trouble thinking about myself as an interesting historical artifact. But it did occur to me as I started to put this together that maybe being interesting or unique is not the point. Maybe being a product of my own time is more historically significant. That is, some things that may be obvious, commonsensical, and not that interesting to me may in fact be unknown, novel, and worthy of consideration by people who did not come of age in the same historical period I did. So I'm going to start with a brief attempt to historicize myself and then go through the other questions that the organizers raised. I'm going to use as an ordering principle the organizers' question about how one project led to the next. This is because mainly historians like chronological order. But also because if I think about that question, how one thing led to the next, my research methods, methodology, use of theory, obstacles, choices about writing all come up at different points. I will keep the focus mainly on Chinese women, but also on some of the puzzles that doing this research raised for me. Chief among those puzzles is the chimera, the elusive and illusory goal of retrieving the past of Chinese women. In particular, I want to consider what we often thought of as going to the source, oral narratives collected from women themselves, and why that is not always possible or does not provide the definitive resolution that we thought it might. And then I want to conclude by thinking about vision and praxis as we grapple with the question of the disappearing past, why we need to stay in an active relationship with that past, incomplete and full of contradictions as it might be, and what we have to lose if we let it go missing on us. Okay, can you all hear me? Is this all right? Should I proceed?
Yes,
Good.
yes.
Okay, so let me begin with myself as briefly as possible. When I was a child at the height of the Cold War, the press painted China in primary colors. Red Menace, this is a 1950 cover from shortly after 1949. Yellow Peril, this image goes back at least to the Boxer Rebellion at the turn of the 20th century. And blue-clad masses working on large construction projects. My first passport, issued in 1968, had a short list of countries that it was forbidden for Americans to visit. China was one of them. China was a back burner story, however, compared to the Soviet threat, and until my first year in college, as far as I remember, I was taught almost nothing about China in school. My main impression of life in China was formed, as for many of my generation, from reading The Good Earth. a novel published in 1931 by Pearl S. Buck and still very popular in the 1950s and 1960s. Buck was the child of missionaries who had grown up in China. The Good Earth takes place sometime around the 1911 revolution. Against this backdrop, Wang Long, a poor peasant, is married to a former slave girl named Olan. During a famine, he and his family flee south to a city. He and his wife both find themselves caught up in a riot, during which a fearful rich man gives Wang Long his money, and Olan finds a hidden bag of jewels. They return home. Wang Long buys more land and also takes a concubine, Lotus. I should say these are screenshots from the movie that was made in Hollywood in 1937, in which, as you can tell if you take a close look, the actors cast were Caucasian because of racist casting practices at that time. They return home. He now has a wife and a concubine. Olan, the wife, remains the moral bedrock of the novel. She's the faithful wife who's concerned for the family's welfare and who understands that land is the key to family solidarity. As she puts it, the land is our life. She anchors family values, and she anchors Wang Long in the early part of his life. She dies toward the end of the book, however, as Wang Long grows more confused. And by the end, it is clear that his grown sons do not share his values and will probably sell the land and squander the family's fortunes. Although I admit that at age 10 or 11, I might not have picked up on this, what struck me later is how the division of labor between Olan, the wife, and Lotus, the concubine, roughly equivalent to good girl, bad girl, or Madonna and whore, resonated very comfortably with stereotypes in the US in the 1930s when the book was written, or the early 1960s when I read it. Pearl Buck was deeply familiar with China, where she spent most of the first 4 decades of her life. But in writing about China, Pearl Buck was also writing to and for America, the America that supported missionaries working to convert China to Christianity. And her work was popular. She won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1938, at least in part because that work promised the exotic, but delivered the emotionally familiar to American readers. Embedded in this story is a cautionary note that has informed much of my work as a historian. When we look at other places and times, we need to attend to who is doing the looking and what we're prepared to see. The historical China you see may be a reflection of your own contemporary sensibilities and concerns. And this is true about gender, as with the good girl, bad girl division between Olan and the concubine, as much as about other aspects of society. So my interest in China was indeed a reflection of contemporary concerns. In the spring of 1971, I was a first-year student in college. Of course, by that time, I was well aware of Asia, thanks to the Vietnam War, which marked my high school and college years and my introduction to political activism. Every young man my age had a draft lottery number. The war was not far away, but was present on our TV screens and in our personal lives and in the streets, where many of us gathered to demonstrate against the war and about domestic injustices. In the official US government account of the war, fear of China and the potential spread of communism from China to Vietnam and on across Asia brought China into the awareness of many of us. Those of us who opposed the war were inclined to be skeptical about this so-called domino theory, in which China was supposed to be toppling its neighbors one by one. In fact, we were inclined to be skeptical of everything our government was telling us about Asia. A shift in public attention began with the April 1971 China visit of the US ping pong team and Nixon's state visit in February 1972. Suddenly, the mainstream US press discovered beggar-free streets, healthy children, acupuncture anesthesia, and national optimism. I began to study Chinese history, and the following year started to study the Chinese language, which has kept me busy and kept me humble ever since. I was compelled by the critique of US imperialism and the appeal of socialist revolution that a self-confident China offered in the early 1970s. And as a participant in the US women's liberation movement of the 1970s, so-called second wave feminism, I was impressed by the Chinese state's explicit commitment to raising the status of women and leaving behind a footbound feudal past. Chinese posters showed women operating heavy construction equipment and marching off in theatrical productions, at least, to defend the nation from invaders. I visited China for the first time in 1975 as a member of a delegation from the US-China People's Friendship Association. Our group was taken to observe women militia members and crews of young women repairing high voltage wires. During the 1970s, progressive bookstores in the United States sold buttons with the Chinese slogan, "Women hold up half the sky," a gesture of international solidarity that also served as a validation of the women's movement in the US. For me and for many others, the study of China and its modern revolutionary history offered a powerful combination of intellectual challenge, social justice, and feminist critique. And the liberation of women, or rather a very particular kind of liberation, was an important part of the story that the Chinese Revolution told about itself, not only in the 1970s when I started paying attention, but at least as early as the late 19th century. I went to China for the second time in 1979 and stayed for 2 years doing research for my PhD dissertation. By 1979, Mao had died, the Gang of Four had been arrested, and the Cultural Revolution was the subject of intense critique and repudiation. I was already aware that China was much more complex than my earlier idealization of it. In the city of Tianjin, I lived in a dormitory at Nankai University with a Chinese roommate, worked with Chinese faculty members and staff, got to know many Chinese students. It was moving and frightening to watch university students try to learn about the United States. It was moving because they worked so hard at it. They had a lot of curiosity and would come up to me with sudden questions throughout the day. And I could usually tell what they were studying in their world history class by what the questions are. What do the American people think of Washington? President Washington. A couple weeks later, what do the American people think of President Lincoln? And then eventually, what do the American people think of Franklin Delano Roosevelt? It was frightening, though, because the questions people asked reflected years of silence and ignorance. They had certainly learned about social upheaval in the United States in the 1960s, but what made a deeper impression on them by the time I was there was the newer portrait of the US as a consumer paradise, awash in easy wealth, with few social problems. Just before and after the 2 years I spent in China, many of the policies associated with the Cultural Revolution were reversed. For instance, university admissions, which had been done on the basis of recommendations from your work unit, no one went straight to university and almost no one went at all. University admissions switched over to a system of national exams. Young people who had spent up to 10 years in the countryside were allowed to take these exams alongside people who were fresh out of high school. The universities were filled with young men and women, some of whom had spent years working in mines, factories, or in the countryside, although most of them were still originally of urban origin. They were smart, savvy about conditions in China, and politically critical. It was partly from listening to their stories that I learned how simple-minded my earlier fantasy of the Chinese Revolution had been, and how much more complicated things were on the ground. An official state slogan at the time I went to China was "Liberate your thinking, 解放思想," although it quickly became clear that there were limits to where publicly expressed political opinions could go. Privately, however, people had a lot to say. I listened and learned. Now I'm going to switch over to how one project led to another, and the underlying theme here again is pursuing the chimera of retrieving the past of Chinese women. and the slides are probably going to get a little less interesting and more static. So I arrived in the northern Chinese city of Tianjin to do dissertation research in 1979, almost by happenstance. As you will see, happenstance turns out to be a recurring theme in how I moved from one project to another. There is no 5-year plan in here. Throughout the period of my PhD coursework, before going to China, I had been interested in working class history and the history of women workers in particular. For 3 summers during graduate school, I worked with a classmate and another friend on an oral history project in the U.S. border town of El Paso, Texas, interviewing Chicano women workers about their earlier participation in a strike against a major pants manufacturer. What I learned in El Paso was mainly that you had to understand the social geography of a community in order to understand the labor environment and the sources of the likely support for laborer struggles. I learned also that it was a good idea when interviewing people to pay attention to the issues that preoccupied them most. Also, as a PhD student, along with my classmate and later my colleague, Emily Honig, I had co-authored 2 papers, one about women industrial workers in Shanghai and one about the transformation of peasant women's labor in the base area of Yan'an. I knew that women were the majority of the industrial working class, mainly in cotton spinning and weaving in China's biggest pre-revolutionary city, Shanghai. But Emily and I decided that we should not both try to be doing research on similar topics in the same city, and I decided to go to Tianjin, China's second biggest pre-revolutionary industrial city. But when I got to Tianjin, I found out that until the 1940s, there had actually been very few women working in Tianjin factories. In fact, in the 1920s, according to social surveys conducted at the time, there were more women working as prostitutes in Tianjin than as industrial workers. I ended up writing a dissertation, which later became my first book, which had a chapter that talked about women, but also followed 2 other sectors of the working class that were dominated by men: handicraft workers in workshops that made iron goods and machine parts, and transport workers that moved goods across the city and loaded them on ships for export or onto boats and vehicles to carry imported goods into the interior of China. One good outcome of being forced to alter my dissertation topic — I couldn't write about women only if there were so few women — was that it was impossible then for me to look at women workers in isolation from their family members, many of whom had been recruited from the countryside to staff all of these different kinds of operations: ironwork, transport, cotton mills. And since there was a shorter history of labor militants than there was among women workers in Shanghai's cotton mills, I learned to pay a great deal of attention to indirect efforts by which women workers strove to make their brutal industrial workday more bearable: slowing down the machines, pilfering cotton yarn by stuffing it in their clothes and carrying it out of the factory, sneaking naps under the machines, and so forth. My notion of what constituted a working class, what the texture was of working class life, and how to understand everyday strategies for getting by were all enriched by my time in Tianjin. I learned a lesson, too, from discovering that women workers in Shanghai were not a good predictor for Tianjin or maybe anywhere else in China. China is a big and varied place, and place matters, as do urban versus rural location, class, generation, and gender. When we use the term China, we are using a kind of shorthand. What is true for Shanghai wasn't true for Tianjin. What is true for the city may not be true for the countryside. What is true for a rich family may not be true for a poor one. What is true for a grandfather or father may not be true for a son. What is true for men may not be true for women. And women are not a unified category either. Gender is an important axis of difference, but place, generation, class, urban, rural, etc., are important divisions among people who would all identify themselves as women. I was privileged and lucky to have the chance to do this research in Tianjin, and I'm forever grateful to the faculty and staff at Nankai University that tried to help me get access to the materials to do my research in a period where research access was just beginning and no one really knew what it meant. There were sometimes obstacles, however. One was that the research environment was very much subject to changes in US-China relations. I spent almost a year working intermittently in the archives of a museum about iron workers in Tianjin. But as Ronald Reagan was campaigning for the US presidency and making various foreign policy pronouncements that did not please the Chinese leadership, I found that my access to these materials was very conditional. One day I arrived at the museum to discover that it was not open to foreigners. 对外不开放. A friend at the museum offered to meet me on a street corner that night, and in a hurried, low voice, he explained to me what had happened. The people at the Culture Bureau, the Wenhuaji, which was in charge of the museum, had grown concerned in the newly tense environment that they might end up being criticized for hosting an American researcher. The Education Bureau, the Jiaoyuji, which was in charge of me, because I was at Nankai, did not have any power over the Culture Bureau, and so I was suddenly denied access. There was nothing to be done about it. There were other constraints on researchers as well. I had very good access to libraries, but at the time, archives were not open to foreign researchers or to most Chinese researchers either. So I didn't have the opportunity to become what historians call an archive rat until later research projects. Nor could I base much of my research on oral history, since arranging interviews with people who had been workers before 1949 relied on the same kinds of constraints that had gotten me kicked out of the museum. I was lucky, however, to meet the mother of a Chinese friend, a woman who had been a child worker in a cotton mill before 1949. She spoke very freely and concretely to me and introduced me to other people who had had similar experiences. And I did have the chance to interview some male former workers in cotton mills during my second year in Tianjin. But the idea that the history of the working class could be reconstructed by talking to workers under these circumstances was not realistic. Okay. As I was spending my days in libraries in Tianjin and in that one museum archive till I got kicked out, and occasional interviews, I was also reading the newspaper, several newspapers in China, and talking to my classmates about contemporary events. As I suggested a minute ago, they were an extremely savvy and critical cohort. And it was very interesting to watch news reporting and political commentary shift in the state-controlled press, and then also listen to the interplay of that official discourse with the sometimes skeptical viewpoint of my classmates. One place where official and unofficial opinions tended to converge, however, was in a newfound interest in gender. When people talk about gender, they are often talking about many other social arrangements and issues as well. Gender, as we are all aware, is a way of signifying social arrangements and power. With my classmate Emily Honig, who was at Fudan University in Shanghai, I started gathering newspaper and magazine clippings with the scissors. There was no internet. Imagine a pre-digital world, if you can, and trying to make sense of what we were seeing and hearing. We kept collecting after we returned to the United States. We watched as the image of heroic, empowered women holding up half the sky began to be displaced by other figures, embedded in other powerful systems of signification. The sexy young mistress, the savvy woman business executive, the canny rural woman entrepreneur, the oppressed migrant factory labor or sex worker. Along with the expansion of opportunities for gendered self-fashioning in the reform era came increasingly visible evidence of gender discrimination and gendered violence, and increased public discussion of both. As many scholars have observed, gender difference and gender hierarchy have been rediscovered as the natural order of things in official and popular realms. The result of our reading in newspapers and popular magazines and our conversation with our classmates was the book Personal Voices, published in 1988, where we did an analysis of and gave some examples of the things we'd been clipping from the press. At the time we wrote it, it was a report on contemporary conditions. Now it's a history book. The China it describes no longer exists. But in spite of the profound changes in China since the book was published, gender difference and gender hierarchy have not disappeared. Arguably, they have, in fact, deepened, especially around the restrictions on women's access to urban real estate and rural property, and the recent pro-natalist turn in Chinese state policy. This book was a side project. We were both supposed to be doing dissertation research, but the side project took on a life of its own. We used whatever sources we found around us. We paid particular attention to the places where the official press either diverged from or unexpectedly reinforced the views of our classmates. An example of divergence between official and popular views. Throughout the early reform period, the state continued to rely on the Women's Federation, which had been shut down during the Cultural Revolution but then reopened, to address women about issues that the state regarded as woman-specific. The content of those issues varied over time, from changes in marriage practices, which was something new and potentially radical in the 1950s, to the need for each woman to maintain a frugal and harmonious household. Here you see an older gender norm being put to new purposes for socialist construction. In the view of the state, the Women's Federation was the approved expression of a kind of state feminism, although they did not use the term feminism because it was associated with bourgeois pre-revolutionary feminism. On the other hand, here's the divergence. None of the college-age women we knew felt that the Women's Federation spoke for them or to them. They were generally of the opinion that the Women's Federation and its efforts were intended for their mothers, and that they themselves, as women brought up predominantly after 1949, would have achievements at work and make their way in a world that offered them opportunities, better opportunities than earlier generations of women had had. There's a kind of self-confidence that came out of growing up during the Mao years that is a feature of this period. As the reform era went on, however, and the Women's Federation more forcefully took up issues of discrimination against women in employment, domestic violence, and trafficking, the Women's Federation may have garnered more respect and attention from younger women. It's hard to say anything definitive about this. This probably needs to be someone else's research project, the changing fortunes and activities of the Women's Federation. Okay, so that's a divergence between official and popular perceptions. Here's an example of where positions in official publications were enthusiastically echoed by our classmates. They welcomed the introduction of more consumer goods and public discussion of adornment, makeup, and courtship. Part of the reform-era state's position on Mao-era policies was that in the Mao years, not enough attention had been paid to natural gender differences. And in some respects, though not all, our classmates tended to agree. Once a classmate asked me why I dressed so plainly in student clothes, which were more or less unisex, even though I was a foreigner who could wear whatever I wanted. "Why are you dressing as though we are still in the Cultural Revolution?" she said to me. Such conversations alerted us to the ways in which our classmates, who, as I said, knew a lot about social inequality and were skeptical about government pronouncements, ways in which they might diverge, their attitudes about what constituted feminism might diverge in style and substance from my US-based notions of feminism and women's liberation. By the time we finished writing Personal Voices, I was acutely aware that ideas about what a woman should do and be are not a stable or prefigured phenomenon. What counts as a woman and what counts as popular womanly behavior were being argued about and changed dynamically on both state and popular levels and in the interaction of those two levels in real time as we watched. These changes affected people's individual and community sense of their own subjectivity. This realization complicated all of my subsequent work on gender. I was no longer simply seeking the retrieval of women's voices. I was simultaneously trying to look at all the ways that ideas about women and the practices that express those ideas, in fact, constitute women. Discourse, in this case and in all of my subsequent research, could not be separated from material reality and daily life. They were intricately interwoven. Let me turn to the project on which I spent more than a decade, from the mid-'80s to the mid-'90s, late '90s, by the time the book came out. As I mentioned a minute ago when I talked about women workers in Tianjin, when I looked at surveys, it looked to me as though that nationalist government's Social Affairs Bureau had counted roughly twice as many prostitutes working in Tianjin as women factory workers. These were separate surveys. They weren't comparing them. The Social Affairs Bureau in the 1930s did not regard prostitution as a type of work. They regarded it as a social problem. But it occurred to me at the time that whether a woman coming into the city of Tianjin from the countryside ended up in a factory or a brothel had everything to do with her network of connections and who brought her to the city. Both outcomes were likely. If I was in search of women in the labor force, I had to ask questions about where women ended up. And of course, here again, my questions were shaped by a debate among both scholars and activists in the United States about whether prostitution should be reconceptualized as sex work, treated like any other form of the sale, commodification, and exploitation of labor power, and separated from moralistic questions about respectable versus disreputable sex. So I got started on this project pursuing my recurrent question of where were the women, and following them into a sector that was, at least in some scholarly quarters, regarded as labor. But it was here, doing the research on prostitution and modernity in 20th century Shanghai, that I learned a profound lesson about the absolute limitations and maybe the undesirability of looking for women's authentic voices as a project. As I began work on this project, I very quickly started to focus on Shanghai, since that was where the paper trail about early 20th century prostitution was richest. I very quickly found that a thick paper trail is not the same thing as unmediated access to the lived experience of Shanghai prostitutes, whether they were courtesans who provided intellectual and sometimes sexual companionship to the city's financial and literary elites, like the woman on the cover of the book here, or streetwalkers who serviced foreign sailors and the male working class population of the city. What I found in all of the voluminous sources on prostitution was almost anything except the voices of prostitutes themselves. I lay this out in more writerly terms in the book, but here's a brief and crude version of this dilemma. Prostitution, like the status of women more generally, was a means for Republican-era elites to voice their concerns about social hierarchies, how those hierarchies were being upended in China's treaty port cities, whether China was or could become modern, whether China would continue down the path of semi-colonialism to become completely colonized by Japan, which was very threatening in this period, whether a strong nation was possible and who could build it, and what kind of status for women would be appropriate for contributing to nation building. At the same time, prostitution was a target for reform by foreign missionaries, Chinese elites, the national state, people concerned with women's rights, and a cacophonous host of others who didn't agree about much, but all found prostitution a worthy topic. And then there was the nostalgic literature about how refined courtesans used to be, about their ability to deliver a withering judgment if a man did not know how to behave properly, the ridicule to which new male urban dwellers might be exposed by courtesans if they didn't know the code of the city, and the pleasures of engaging in witty repartee with courtesans and with other men in the presence of courtesans. Finally, in the course of various state campaigns to regulate prostitutes, there were not only endless writings, but also published position papers, but also archival traces in which you could occasionally actually hear a prostitute talk. But these women, under interrogation by the police for street walking in the 1940s, always said the same thing. They came from the countryside, they were destitute, they were filial, they were supporting their rural families at home, and they had no alternative to the work they were doing. These voices of prostitutes spoke in such unvarying, formulaic terms that it raised a serious question about whether the police scribe who recorded all the interrogations was using a kind of pre-computer version of a kind of template. But my point here is that the so-called voice of the prostitute remained elusive, even while she was speaking directly to a policeman. This problem was exacerbated by the fact that it was not possible for me to collect my oral narratives from women, to collect any oral narratives from women who had formerly worked as prostitutes. The New People's Republic government in the 1950s had conducted a much publicized campaign to take in, reform, retrain, and sometimes marry off former prostitutes. I spoke to a number of the reformers who had participated in that campaign. Some of them were still in touch with former prostitutes, but when they made inquiries with those women on my behalf, no one wanted to talk to me. Even women who had spoken to the newspapers in the 1950s by name about how the revolution had liberated them from prostitution were not willing to go back and rehash their pre-1949 histories with a foreigner who would undoubtedly attract attention from the neighbors and sometimes from their family members who were not always aware of the past histories of their mothers and grandmothers. It would have been unethical and quite likely futile for me to argue with this reasoning. So there was no fantasy of retrieval of women's voices that I could indulge in here. Eventually, as I discuss in the book, and as Xiaoxian mentioned, I realized I should stop looking for some core of authentic voice, which was like peeling an onion till my eyes burned, and then in the end you just have a dismembered vegetable. Instead, I decided to look at each layer of the onion and ask what it could tell me about prostitution as a powerful signifier of social hierarchy, nostalgia for the past, national distress, and aspirations for reform. When the question was reconfigured that way, suddenly answers about many aspects of life in early 20th century Shanghai appeared. Once again, I was reminded that discourses shape people, but they also shape what we are able to understand about the past. So we'd better do our best to understand the making of those discourses. By this point in the scholarly environment in the United States, Foucault and others who wrote about discourse, subalterns, colonialism, and so forth provided a rich trove of insights on which I could draw. But my approach to theory on this project, as in all of my other work before or since, has been somewhat promiscuous and opportunistic. If I find a problem that I can't solve or even fully articulate, I look around to see how people writing about other times and places have developed conceptual tools. I pick things up and try them out and put them in conversation with the fragmentary historical material I am encountering. If the conversation is productive, I hang on to the theory and use it to raise more questions. If not, I move on. I don't want to give the impression that I just flit around from one theory to the next. I have a lifelong affinity for Marxist analysis, especially when interrupted by feminist insights. I began as a social historian, but was forced by circumstance and ultimately found it productive and fascinating to pay attention to discourse. I remain skeptical of theory uncritically applied to a situation. To draw on a conversation I've had with Yu Xin, I would not, for example, go into a Chinese village looking for the Oedipus complex or any checklist drawn from classic psychoanalytical theory. But I don't know how I would operate without Donna Haraway's situated knowledge, or Jim Clifford's concept of articulation, or Stuart Hall's conjuncture, or Gramsci's hegemony, or Edward Said's Orientalism, or Wendy Brown's critique of neoliberalism, or Judith Butler's analyses of gender. Dangerous Pleasures forced me and enabled me to encounter much contemporary cultural theory and ask how it might be good to think with. The Gender of Memory, as some of you may know, is a study of rural women in several Shanxi villages, tracing the changes in their lives brought by the revolution and the first decade or so of rural collectivization. Along the lines of how I wandered from one project to another, in this case, it was directly the experience of teaching that led me to want to do this work. When I went through graduate school in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Chinese history stopped in 1949. That's when the responsibility for our field, mastery of the literature, stopped. Anything that happened after the establishment of the People's Republic of China was studied by political scientists and sociologists and later anthropologists. But with time, historians started looking at the early years of the PRC as history. When I began to teach that history to undergraduates, I found that what was available to give students to read was in general very urban-centered and more focused on the Cultural Revolution than on anything that had happened before or after that. At the time of the establishment of the People's Republic, approximately 80% of the Chinese people were in rural locations and made their living farming the land. That meant that roughly 40% of the Chinese population was rural women. And yet there was almost nothing I could give my students to read that would help them understand what had happened to women during a major shift in state power, the years of collectivization, the Great Leap Forward, and its aftermath. Fortunately for me, as I was pondering these questions, I met Gail Xiaoxian, who was directing the research office of the Provincial Women's Federation in Shanxi Province. She was trained in history and had done postgraduate work in sociology, but her interest in rural women in the 1950s was less academic and more policy-driven. She was trying to figure out what kinds of policies might benefit rural women in the 1990s. She wanted to look at the legacy of rural collectivization and at what sorts of interventions had been helpful in improving women's lives and which ones had been ineffective or harmful. Our interests converged in the desire to go to rural areas and ask women themselves what had happened to them before 1949 and during the early years of the PRC, while backing up the collection of oral narratives with whatever documentary material we could find in archives and newspapers and yearbooks and other sources. From 1996 to 2006, we interviewed 72 women, mainly farmers in 4 different villages, but also a few who had worked in the Women's Federation in the first years of the People's Republic. Today, I just want to say 2 main things about this project. The first is that my work with Gail Xiaoxian was the most intense and productive intellectual collaboration I have ever had with anyone. Across my career, I have co-authored and co-edited books and been in extended and wonderful conversations with many colleagues in the United States and China who were also doing research on aspects of Chinese women's history. But this collaboration was something else. Gail Xiaoxian and I had diverse but overlapping research agendas, and we planned to write our individual work for different audiences. But we designed interviews together in the course of lengthy conversations over a number of years. We went to villages in Shanxi where I would definitely not have had smooth access as a solo foreign researcher, and she was the one who explained our project to local women and asked the initial question, "Can you tell us about your life before 1949 and during collectivization?" After that, mainly what we did was sit back, listen closely, and ask follow-up questions. Women were extremely eager to talk to us. Most of them had been through things that subsequent generations would have a hard time imagining. But their children and grandchildren did not necessarily want to listen to them review their lives, nor were their achievements during the 1950s very valued in Reform era China. And of course, a number of them had personal grievances and issues that helped fuel their desire to talk. But the main value of the collaboration with Gao Xiaoxian for me, in addition to allowing me to have access to these conversations, was our constant ongoing dialogue between the two of us about what we were finding out. Most evenings when we were staying in villages after a day of interviewing, we would go for long walks and talk about what we had learned that day. Usually, if something puzzled me, it could be explained as a product of my lack of intimate familiarity with Chinese villages. But if something puzzled both of us, including Gao Xiaoxian, with her experience having spent part of her childhood in the Chinese countryside and then going again as a sent-down youth, something puzzled her. It usually meant that the puzzle was worth sorting out. There are examples of this that I talk about in the book, but one of them is how women referred to national political campaigns mainly by the effect that it had on their daily lives and labor. For instance, they understood the term Great Leap Forward, but they used the phrase, the time when we ate in the dining halls, when they themselves spoke of that period. Often they collapsed or confused various stages of collectivization in the telling, but there was usually some reason why those things had either receded in memory or been recombined in their minds with other events. Puzzling through these rearrangements allowed us to understand something about how the past appeared to them. It's possible that Gao Xiaoxian learned some things from me, since I arrived every summer with a new set of questions about governance, temporality, collective memory, and other issues shaped by the intellectual environment in U.S. universities. But mainly what's obvious to me is how much I learned from her unquenchable curiosity and determination to help change things for the better for women in the Chinese countryside. You may know that she died this past April, and I want here to honor her memory and also to say how much she will be missed as a researcher and a force for good in social change. The second thing I want to say about this project is that it was in some ways the apotheosis of my lifetime desire to chase down women's history by collecting oral narratives. This was a situation where I could access many oral histories, unlike the circumstances in many of my previous projects. Oral history was the heart of this enterprise, though, as I said, we used many other types of sources as well. But the whole enterprise also shows the limitations and the elusive quality of narrated memory. We were asking women about events that had happened 40 or 50 years earlier. And so some parts of that past had disappeared, while others had been reconfigured as women went on and had new experiences, changing what they thought about their own histories. Sometimes this caused them to re-emphasize heroic accomplishments from their youth, partly as a way of talking back to a society that no longer listened to or valued their accomplishments. Partly, they brought their present opinions to bear on their past lives. This was the case, for instance, when they voiced criticism of the effects of some aspects of collectivization, particularly during and after the Great Leap Forward. And they would contrast these criticisms to the enthusiasm they had felt back then at the time. The thing I want to emphasize here is that access to oral narratives is always about complex interactions between the past and the speaking present, even when the person is a detailed and mesmerizing storyteller. What we are hearing has to be understood as something other than a simple account of the past. The past is always already disappearing. And practicing historians should acknowledge and work with that uncomfortable truth. I will add one more observation here. When listening to these women, it was very important not to assume that they had certain attitudes or emotional configurations. The things that upset them, the things that bring or brought them pleasure, might not have been the same, were probably not the same as ours, whether you're talking about me as a foreigner or Gao Xiaoxian as a person who grew up in a different generation from these women. I don't want to substitute my subjectivity for theirs as a way of making sense of their lives. I don't want to commit what I think of as the mistake Pearl Buck made in The Good Earth, to bring my own preoccupations and superimpose them on the accounts I am getting from women, so that their stories become legible and comforting and emotionally validating to me or my readers. And so I've gotten into the habit as a historian of stopping and saying something to the reader when a person's experience or a situation seems unknowable or impossible to reconstruct. This is not a reason to abandon the search for the disappearing past, but we do need to pay attention to the ways in which the past is not fully accessible to us, and to accept the immensity and the complexity of things we cannot know. Okay, now about your small categories of vision and praxis, and staying in relationship with the disappearing past. Before I end, I want to touch on that question. What are we going to do with the disappearing past? Do we need it? And if so, for what purposes? What is an ethical relationship to the past? How might it be helpful as we imagine various futures? You've probably all heard the old saying, those who do not know history are condemned to repeat it. Personally, I don't find this helpful. I don't think we are condemned to repeat history because although I don't believe in a narrative of progress where things always move forward and get better, I don't think history goes around in circles either. Another old saying says that history does not repeat itself, but it rhymes. That might be more helpful. But figuring out where and how it rhymes, what sort of poetry is being created here, is tricky. And there is not a preconceived formula that lets us do so. Even though these two sayings are not of huge help in prescribing how we should approach the past, I don't believe it's a good idea for us to dismiss history, to dismiss or trivialize the self-understandings of people in the past. To do so is to practice what the British historian E.P. Thompson called the enormous condescension of posterity. You know, where you think everybody who came before you was stupid and just didn't get it, but you have the answers. Specifically, in the case of earlier generations of feminists, both in the United States and China, I don't think that those who came before us were stupid or benighted in their attitudes. Although, when I read white American 19th century feminists talking about people of color, it can make me cringe. And the elitism embedded in the work of what Joan Judge called Republican ladies in nationalist China was also very much a product of its time. However, I think we lose a lot when we let previous generations of women and previous generations of feminists and gender activists go missing from our understanding of the world. In the case of China, for instance, I don't think that the old party activists like Deng Yingqiao and other people who were later dismissed as Ma Lie Lao Tai Tai should be so easily cast aside. I think it's important to understand the environment in which they were operating, as historian Wang Zheng has done, to explore the discourses that shaped their own sense of what they were up to, and the steps they took to preserve an agenda for gender equity, even if it was not my vision of gender or of equity. One thing that can go wrong when historical inquiry is actively suppressed, as it has been in both China and the United States in recent years, is that people are literally unaware of those who came before them and unable to draw on what those people thought and did. Not as a formula for how to behave in the present, but as a guide and sometimes as a negative example of how people approached problems in the past. This is not a remote problem. Some of you may know that in the United States, there has recently been a directive from the federal government to the Smithsonian Institution to go through and remove material that is considered unflattering to a certain version of the American story, especially the story of American exceptionalism, how we are unlike all others in the world of nations. Since the American story has human slavery and indigenous genocide, among its constitutive elements, along with many other more inspiring elements, this means that certain kinds of material are currently being whitewashed. I am encouraged by the fact that a spontaneously organized volunteer group of hundreds of people in the Washington area, put together by people including China historians in the history department at Georgetown University, went out recently to photograph every exhibit in the Smithsonian before any of the contents were altered. That material needs to remain available as a resource as we all try to figure out how we got here and what to do next. It is not that the exhibits on the walls of the Smithsonian were perfect. Museum exhibits, like other versions of history, are products of contestation and negotiation. But if we think of our history as an unstable but achieved state, a crystallization of conversations and conflicts, and something that can serve as a basis from which we might draw new conclusions in the future, you can see why it's not desirable for it to be replaced by something from which all traces of conflict have been erased. The same is true of the history of women in China. In my last book, which was intended for use as a textbook, I have drawn on the work of many scholars of my generation to make arguments about why women are important in Chinese history. How gender and the conceptualizing of women in particular provided a language with which to speak contemporary political dilemmas. And also how the labor of women, often rural women, underwrote socialist modernization in the Mao years and laid the groundwork for the current reform era. I think there's a lot more work to be done on these questions. We need more consideration of how the gendered division of labor and the discourses through which it was framed made much of women's work on social reproduction and caregiving only partially visible and under-remunerated, even as the state relied on women's labor for its grand development schemes. Fabio Lanza and Yi Godong, among others, are doing very good work on these questions. There's a lot in that history to work with. There's still more to analyze, and in that sense, making the invisible visible is an unfinished project. One use of that project for us, I think, is to try to envision and enact a future that repairs some of the injustices of the past and allows for a more equitable society and a more livable planet. These are big stakes, and they require big envisioning. They also require, in my opinion, the daily practice of doing and talking about and arguing about gender as an important axis of history. I particularly applaud the group United Proud Women for trying to air some of these questions, while also trying to preserve pieces of the disappearing past, including archival traces and oral histories. The work of your group puts you in an active relationship with the disappearing past by preserving what can be collected, but also by asking questions, sometimes critical ones, about issues that previous generations of feminists did and did not consider. I am hopeful that you will figure out ways to put these pieces to good use and to transmit them to the generations that come after you. Thank you so much for the chance to share these reflections.
That was so amazing. We learned so much about the background behind all of these legendary work of excellence. And that indeed completes the circle that we have prompted at the very beginning, allowing Professor Hershatter's scholarship and her character to be the guiding stars for our shared future of recognition, mutual support, and women's solidarity. With that, we cede the floor to the audience. Now, we have already collected a bunch of questions and we have ranked in our sheet. So I am going to ask the audience to prompt their questions in the order that we have received them. So the first one by Ning Ning. Ning Ning cannot open her mic and share right now, so she asked me to do this for her. So I'm going to read this question out loud. As a distinguished scholar of women's history, do you find your identity as a historian and identity as a scholar of women's studies incompatible or compatible in what sense? In other words, have you ever undergone the moment at some point of your career that historicist principle and the feminist approach and or the two disciplines thereof conflict with each other? What would you say to young historians on this matter? Thank you very much.
So identity as a historian and as a gender studies scholar, is the conflict between those two.
Yes.
History is kind of a conservative profession, discipline. And although historians are often quite groundbreaking, they're usually talking back to the rest of the discipline and how things have been. And women's studies was a product of a very particular moment, later gender studies, and regarded constituted itself as a kind of insurgent formation. So the whole point was to go in and make trouble wherever you were by raising questions about whatever discipline you were in. And that's true not only in history, but in anthropology, sociology, even political science may be one of the last to go and most conservative in that way. Um, the way I personally experienced some of this, besides being, I don't know, the second woman hired by the history department in my very first job, you used to be able to go into the ladies' room to get away from almost all of your colleagues. Um, the main way that I experienced this was that sometimes there was I was surrounded by supportive people. I was very lucky. My PhD advisors who put up with our running off to El Paso, but also our defining Emily's and my defining topics around gender. Um, the people in both my first job at Williams College and my job here at University of California, Santa Cruz, and a network of us who were working on Chinese women's history in the US, um, in North America, and eventually lots of interlocutors in China too. That was all very supportive, but sometimes the larger profession was a little bit incredulous, especially when I moved over to working on prostitution. You call that a historical topic? Really? Isn't that just sex? I mean, we all know what prostitution is. It's the world's oldest profession. There's nothing else to say about it. There's nothing particularly historically interesting. The end. Um, and that was true of some colleagues here. It was also true when I first started doing work on that topic in China. Um, People looked at me and said, "What kind of a topic is that?" And then this very interesting thing happened, which is that prostitution started to reemerge as a very visible social problem in 1980s and 90s and early 21st century China. And as it did, people in China started investigating it. And all of a sudden, I had lots of people to talk to, where when I started doing this work, I had sounded like an outlying lunatic. Everybody, joined me and then surpassed me in the kinds of research they could do about this. So, yeah, it's sometimes been annoying to realize much of the profession um, wasn't exactly as committed to some of these things as we were. But it was also, um, you got to think of yourself as a little revolutionary inside an academic institution. That's always fun. Um, a strong sense of comradeship among people who were doing this kind of work, and a sense across the period of my career that we actually did bring a lot of knowledge into visibility that was not available when we came into the field. And for that, I feel very grateful.
Thank you, Professor Hershatter. I hope Ning that answered your question. The second question comes from River Lin. River Lin, are you able to unmute yourself and post this question by yourself?
Okay, thank you for your amazing talk. Professor Hershatter, you mentioned your early work has been informed by the historical materialism and paid a lot of attention on working class women. Do you think this specific focus on rural or working class is still relevant for women's history in China. My reading of Chinese women's history made me think of the diverse or different experience of women. What do you think of the previous scholarship on certain representative women like state feminism or elite women, including the women in the state system, and the gap between the representative and underrepresented women? And I saw like your first book is a parallel to the like sisters and strangers.
Mhm.
So I feel like a lot of Marxist informed scholarship are done by like the signages instead of the scholar in China. So that's my puzzle.
Well, of course, people in China during the time I was doing the research for the Tianjin book had particular reasons to be questioning a particular version of Marxism. They're formed by a very different kind of environment. Yeah, you're pointing to exactly that set of differences among women, among people who are generally socially recognized as women, and the fact that some of them are much better represented in the historical record than others. So what do I think of previous scholarship on women like state feminism or elite women, including the women in the party state system? I don't actually think we know enough about them either, but I completely understand why people have been drawn to those topics because there is stuff you can read. There are people with names. It doesn't rely completely on the vagaries of ethnographic work. And when you do kind of quasi ethnographic work or oral narrative collecting like I did to try to get at the lives of less elite women, as I just talked about, you encounter all other kinds of problems. So I think my answer to your question is something like everything everywhere all at once. I don't think it's a mistake to focus on elite women. And I think it's great to try to focus on working class and peasant women when you can. And that's where my interests have led me. But I think that responsibility that all of us have is to try to bring each piece of what we are bringing into visibility in conversations with other pieces and pieces that remain invisible. So a study of party state women shouldn't just be a study of party state women. It should be, what's their relationship to those other people in the party state? What's their relationship to people who are not in the party state apparatus, and so forth. Thanks for the question. It's a really good, complicated question.
Thank you, River. And in the onion metaphor, that is every peel has its own dense texture that we can study. Okay, moving on to Jessica Chen. I believe let me know how you pronounce your name and whether you're there to unmute yourself and pose a question. I love your question, by the way. This also makes me very curious.
Oh, yes. Hi. Hi, Professor Hershatter. Thank you so much for your talk. Right, I was just interested in how you talked about emotional configurations and memory, in particular, how emotions might have shaped women's memories of the Maoist past. And when I was reading your work, The Gender of Memory, I was struck by how this feelings of pain and suffering, but also very much interlaced with their attachment to an era's idea of a sense of optimism and idealism that's future oriented. And so I was just curious if you can talk a bit more about how you approach these very complex layers of emotions, and are there perhaps ways that you may want to proceed with like emotional dimensions in future projects, future or history projects as well? Thank you.
Thanks. Well, the last part of that question is easy to answer. For the oral history projects, over to your generation. I was so acutely aware and have become even more aware since of how lucky I was to have any access at all to, for instance, rural populations in Shanxi. That project would not be possible for me to do now. I don't know if it would be possible for anybody to do now, but certainly people who have relatives who experience those things, or networks of connections that they can use to get at that, are in a better position than I am. And you will also be talking to a different generation that came of age later, because the people we interviewed in the late 90s and early 2000s are pretty much all no longer with us. The emotional question, it's interesting. It comes up in a way I haven't actually seen people write about a lot, as a sort of methodological question. What do you do when you're doing interviewing and someone is who you're listening to is suddenly overcome with sorrow or anger, or a kind of pride in past achievements that is tinged with a certain kind of defiance, but you can't be sure at whom the defiance is directed. Is it people who slighted her in the past? Is it her daughter-in-law who's not treating her properly now? Is it the Chinese Communist Party? You know, is it somebody she had an argument with last week? We encountered these interviews were all suffused with people's emotions. And I think the things we ended up paying the most attention to were the kinds of responses that kept repeating themselves across interviews, you know, and across, I mean, everyone had their own personality and very different characters, but when people kept emphasizing and vociferously declaring certain kinds of things, when they were in some way either talking back to their own past or talking back to the present in which they found themselves, reading those affects together, to use the term of your question, and approaching them methodologically, you know, we were always asking the question, what is shaping this set of responses? This is the set of circumstances under which we get to know about the 1950s in Shanxi villages. But it's the only set of of conditions we're going to have. What's shaping these conditions? That was a lot of what we were talking about, you know, walking up and down these roads in the villages. And I would urge anybody who does subsequent work, and I hope any of you who are so inclined will, and who have access will start doing that kind of interviewing immediately. I think it is worth sitting and taking this stuff into account and asking yourself, not only what did that person say to me today, but how did that person say it? And what is driving that account? And what animates that person as they look back on their lives from a distance of some decades? And, you know, I don't know if you call that a methodology, but it is what we ended up doing as a research practice. And I think it was very useful for us.
Thank you, Professor Hershatter. The next question comes from a fellow aspiring historian, Vicky, who also helped us editing the introduction and a big fan of Professor Hershatter's work. So why don't you, Vicky, unmute and introduce yourself?
Hello, Professor Hershatter.
Hi, Vicky.
Yes, I think following up to the last question, Jessica's wonderful question, I'm more curious in how you respond to that emotional affect and how you were emotionally driven by the response. How did you react and how did you theorize your own emotions? But the question I ask is also about the logistic of oral history. So how do we translate the very Western-rooted concept of consent in rural China, and how do we understand the relationship between the oral history interviewer and interviewee? Do you think that's a relationship of care? Do you think that's a relationship of exploitations? How do you theorize the relationship?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, how did I react? I mean, I was very moved by a lot of these stories, but sometimes I was concentrating so hard on just trying to follow what people were saying to me in Shanxihua that some of the most devastating stories I didn't fully allow to sink in until I saw the transcripts and sat with them and read them over and over again. You know, and some readers of the book have said to me, especially around women's stories of childbirth, that they found them unbearable to read. And it made me think, did I find them unbearable to listen to? Not really, because I was listening so hard, I didn't have time to think about whether I thought it was unbearable or not. Just the attempt to get across that huge gulf in years and experience and language and try to apprehend what was being said. That was enough to keep my little brain busy. The ethics of consent and exploitation. Yeah, Gail Hershatter and I talked about it a lot. And of course, I felt it even more acutely as a foreigner. Protocols of consent for oral history in the United States have been the subject of a lot of discussion. Some of you who do survey research may know that you go before an institutional review board and you tell them what you're going to do and you get permission. The position of the American Oral History Association, I think we've talked about this in the group that organized this seminar before, is that oral histories are one-offs. They're not like other kinds of data collection, and that IRB protocols that are meant to address those kinds of large-scale surveys and people's personal health data and stuff like that are not relevant to oral history. But at the same time, the Oral History Association and us personally, just as a matter of principle, felt like, first, do no harm. And what that means has to be attended to very carefully, regardless of what the person says. So we always said to people, can we share your account? Here's what we want to do with it. This one's teaching in a US university where people don't know much about China. This one's doing policy research. Can we use your name? Can we use your location? Pretty much everybody said yeah, and nobody ever said no. Sometimes when people said yes, later we thought they have no idea what they're consenting to by saying yes, and we better err in the direction of protecting them more, not less, from possible consequences. And of course, as we were conducting this research from the late 90s to 2006, the internet was taking off in China. It was no longer the case that if you interviewed somebody in a village and they were talking extremely freely to you about highly personal stuff, that nobody in the village would ever find out about it. Anything could boomerang around anywhere. So we had to take account of that. So we ended up giving pseudonyms to everybody who wasn't a public figure. So everyone who wasn't a labor model, who had a big published paper trail already, whether or not they had told us we could use their real names. In general, women, the women we interviewed, their desire to talk was so palpable, and their sense of grievance about stuff that they wanted to settle, and their lack of fear about authorities was also really interesting. One person actually said to us, what are they going to do to me? Send me down to the countryside to become a peasant? I'm a peasant. And that was someone who actually had high Guanxi and had a brother who'd ended up with the Nationalist Army in Taiwan and had some trouble because of that. So she wasn't talking from the point of view of someone who had been untouched by political controversy. And they made it really clear to us that they thought it was a great idea for their stories to be known everywhere. Although sometimes people would say, you can talk about this to anyone you want, just not my own village. And that was one of the reasons why we anonymized everybody, because like I said, by the time we got to the point of publishing things, the chance of things coming back home to roost were much greater than they'd been when we conducted the interviews. Inherently, it's sort of exploitative for anybody to ask anyone else's story and then put it in print. It just is. And I think the best thing to do is acknowledge that and say, this is why I'm doing it. And this is the level of consent that I got. And this is why all of us thought that a greater good would be served by doing this. Both, in my case, for generations of students, in the cases of the women who were talking to us, they wanted their voices heard. They did not want to be silenced.
Wow, that again resonates on all of the feedback on Professor Hershatter being super attentive and careful in conducting research. And that is a lot to learn for all of us as aspiring scholars or historians. So the next question comes from Shan Shan, a feminist question. Shan Shan, why don't you go ahead and ask yourself?
Hi, Professor Hershatter. Like I just feel like so emotional today because I come from Xi'an. So I feel like that kind of connection is yeah, it is really like it really lived my day. So I always hear this kind of statement that the Chinese women's liberation movement is not a practice of feminism, which is defined by Western knowledge. I guess my question is, what is your opinion about this statement? And like how as a OG in scholar, like a OG scholar, like what is like how to like a younger scholars, how can we think critically about feminism from different culture perspective? Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I will own the O in OG. I don't know about the G part of it. Don't know that I've earned that. Chinese women's liberation, is it feminism? Is feminism a Western practice? I think I've learned a lot from actually people in my generation who are in China, who have been wrestling with this, and my generation and younger in China who've been wrestling with this question of, should we be indigenizing feminism? What is our feminism and all of that? And I think there are also people working here, especially I'm thinking of Rebecca Carl and Lydia Liu and Dorothy Ko translating He Jun's work and saying, look, there is a Chinese feminist tradition that was already fully globalized and in conversation with radical anarchism in the early 20th century. So, on the one hand, there's this kind of let's indigenize this. And then on the other hand, there's this let's participate fully in circulating global discourses of feminism, both of which, and also a kind of Marxist inflected party state feminism. That's not just a Chinese discourse, it's a globally circulating discourse through the Soviet Union and the Eastern Europe and many other places. So I think trying to make a strict division between what China does and what everybody and what feminism is out there is ultimately not productive because things have been circulating for a really long time. On the other hand, this is where Donna Haraway's situated knowledges concept is super useful to me. When something is taken up by people in a particular local situation and used and deployed to make sense of the world they find around them, it gets changed in the deployment and in the taking up. And then it might enrich what goes around and circulates next, or it might stay in a local situation, but you have to pay attention to the process by which a knowledge becomes situated. And so thinking about Western feminism as an originary discourse and China as some kind of derivative thing that's struggling to indigenize, I think is doesn't make any sense to me any more than thinking of colonialism and semi-colonialism as something that came to China and China just responded. Doesn't make sense as a way to understand it to me. Once you've got those things circulating and you've got local responses, and the local responses require people in China to be far more aware of ideas coming from the rest of the world than the rest of the world necessarily is of ideas coming from China. You are talking about circulation. You're not talking about hived off national traditions. So how I would advise younger scholars to think critically about this. I think one thing that's been on my mind a lot, because I paid close attention to the Xiaoxian generation of feminist scholars in China and what they were reacting against. And now I have seen a younger, generally more queer and gender fluid generation of you all start to emerge. And, you know, my wish is that the resources that they provided and the knowledge that they made should not pass from the scene and be subjected to the enormous condescension of posterity. You know, even if there might be mutual incomprehension or rejection of certain kinds of things that came through that generation. I think thinking about this as a kind of genealogy of feminism that's not about a direct line of transmission. There's lots of interruption, there's ruptures, and there's conflict, but all of that stuff is a resource. And I think you are, and also we in this country are, in a position where we better pick up every resource we have and figure out how to use it. Hope that helps.
That is so powerful. Really far away from the condescension of posterity. Who can resist the powerful message from He Yingzhen, from Qiujing, from Hershatter's research on the Shanghai courtesan and marginalized women? That's just so powerful. And we're all women in solidarity. That's such an amazing message. The next question comes from Christy Liu. Christy Liu, are you there to pose your question about strategies and to battle conservatism?
Yes. Hi, my name is Christy, and I was from communication department, like film. So, this one is more related to social media, public communication, something. So, as you see, sorry, as you mentioned just now, I completely agree with you that the history is always moving forward instead of repeating or circling. However, in other words, do you agree with that? It implies that our current situation is more and more complicated than that in the history. For example, the prostitution issues in Shanghai around the 1940s would be much more different than what is happening in current Chinese society. So, for example, prostitution or maybe just commodified female body will right now appears in a more different way in Chinese society. For example, from streaming to like some videos appears on social media platforms. There are more subtle ways to commodify women's body. So do you think our situation is more and more complicated, and like you maybe if you see it, there's a lot of a, a lot of controversy appears on the social media platforms. Women have from different backgrounds are attack each other because of they have different opinions. Do you see there's I see there's a lot of accounts appears in Chinese society right now and also in the whole all over the world. No matter in Instagram or TikTok, it's all over the world. There's a trend of conservatism is on the rise worldwide. So could you mind to share some of your opinions about like women's situation under such a tendency, no matter in China or in the Western society? So yeah, thank you.
That is such a huge question. That question is almost coterminous with the known universe at this moment. And it's a great question and an important one. You know, the piece of it that's about what is to be done, I am as concerned about that as you are, and I wish I had the answer. And at the same time, I feel like we are in kind of a dire situation. We're not all in the same dire situation worldwide, but we're in different kinds of localized dire situations. And we better not rush to a solution until we have a good long think about how we got here. Because how we got here, how we arrived at this conjuncture, I think is going to help us figure out how we move out of it. That doesn't mean sit around, twiddle your thumbs, do nothing, and play with your footnotes for the next 5 years, but it does mean, think twice before you think we know what a solution is right now, because I think whether you're talking about the commodification of women on social media in China and off social media in China, and indeed worldwide, or you're talking about other kinds of political problems, I think any of us who is being honest will say we have been blindsided by some aspects of things that have happened. And obviously, I've got the contemporary US political situation on my mind. But if I had been, looking around in China in 2006, I wouldn't have predicted the particular configuration of China in 2025 either. And I think we need to ask how these things happened and be as careful as we can about analyzing that, and also analyzing not just top-down sources of growing conservatism, but especially the bottom-up ones and the circulating ones. So what you just said about TikTok and Instagram and social media, something I feel really inadequate personally to analyze, I think is going to be crucial to trying to figure our way out of this. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I came of age and came into the China field in a narrative of historical change that was dominated by, on the one hand, a narrative of progress. Things are getting better and better. And in some ways, by some indices, that is true. And on the other hand, a narrative of resistance. Where there is oppression, there is resistance. And I am feeling I'm very cognizant that those tools for understanding history alone are not sufficient. They don't explain very long, slow ripening conditions that can suddenly erupt into a conservative turn, for instance. So I think we need to work to figure out ways to think about history differently. And to me, that's really tangled up with the need to learn how to analyze and think about the present differently. Sorry if that's vague, but if I had a clue like what the program was for what we should all be doing now, believe me, I would share it with you.
Thank you so much. But I think you mentioned pretty important things is to really think about how we come here, how everything changed to the contemporary situation. And I think that's pretty important because the history always gives some clues to how I think it's kind of some guideline to how we facing the problems in this our current problems, and maybe have some signs to the future. But I agree with you that the history is always moving forward. We are becoming more better and better, but maybe we just need to give more time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. How lucky of us that Professor Hershatter can work together on this strategy with us, and together we can figure something out moving forward. The next question comes from Fan Xi He about Li Xiaojiang's critique. This one's interesting. Fan Xi, do you want to share this by yourself?
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Professor. So I think this talk is very interesting. I think your answers to every question is interesting. I think this is also related to previous question. So so Li Xiaojiang, I think you know her, and she also passed away this year. And in her last book published in 2024, she critiqued your work, The Gender of Memory, for what she sees as an over-reliance on methodological individualism, and arguing that it overlooks the systematic progress achieved through state policies. And how do you respond to her critiques? And just more broadly, how do you view the generation of feminist scholars
scholars, they often characterize as the state or masculinist feminist. And what is your perspective on their essentialist stance, which they focus more on the natural sexual differences? I think that's because of their emphasizing more on women's liberation. Yeah, that's my question.
Okay. Well, Li Xiaojiang will also be much missed. She was a really inventive and original intelligence, and I learned a lot from her. And, I don't want to say too much because she's not available to have a dialogue with anymore, but I think the gender of memory overlooking the systematic progress achieved through state policies, I think Li Xiaojiang was a contrarian. When she was talking to state policies, she was saying, and this was her initial critique that a lot of us paid attention to, was the state coming and delivering a particular version of 妇女解放 actually foreclosed the possibility of a feminist movement that grew up out of people's self-articulated needs. And so now we got to go back and rethink that now that we're in the early reform period. And when she burst onto the scene with that critique, it was a huge criticism of the systematic progress achieved through state policies. However, I agree with her that there was a lot of systematic progress achieved through state policies and that it needs to be acknowledged. And a lot of feminists of her generation who grew up in the Mao years, as the state was pushing to repudiate everything about that time period, talked back to the state and said, oh, no. Like, here are things I got from growing up under the red flag and having that sense of self-confidence and capability and so forth. So I think, what changed in the Mao years and also some of the revolutionary aspirations of the Mao years that went off the rails have to be taken very seriously as goals, as incompletely achieved goals, and as also in some ways laying the groundwork for economic development in the reform era, and in some ways for the gender inequality of the reform era. But that's a longer, more complicated question. Over-reliance on methodological individualism, I don't exactly know what that means. When you sit down and collect an oral narrative from an individual, by its nature, that's an individual's source. Li Xiaojiang is the editor of 3 amazingly useful volumes of oral narratives about women at war, each of which could be accused of methodological individualism. So I kind of feel like part of her work in critiquing gender of memory is talking back to another part of her work that I've learned an enormous amount from. And it would be great to have a conversation with her about that, but I can't. I'm grateful for her attention and her engaging with the work.
Thank you
Wow, both of the senior scholars continuously self-critique and re-critique and critique each other's work. That's how we make amazingly rigorous history. So I guess next question is also related. That's from Lu, about the rigor of conducting oral history. Are you there, Lu?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. And I'm studying the oral histories of the 8,000 young women, a group of young women sent from Hunan to Xinjiang in the 1950s to support foreign construction. And over the past 2 decades, their stories have been repeatedly published in different oral history collections. What I find interesting is that the same narrators often tell their stories quite differently across time. Sometimes the tone changes, sometimes certain experiences disappear. So my question is, as researchers, how should we approach and use these oral narratives that are inevitably shaped by memory, emotion, and the present context? Should we treat such shifts as a problem of reliability or as something meaningful in themselves? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a recurring question around collecting oral narratives. You know, I think when narratives keep shifting over time, the historian has to ask, why are these narratives shifting over time? Like, what are the forces that are making these narratives shift over time? And think about as many possibilities as possible and present them and argue for the ones you think are more plausible, but mainly make the reader aware that the narratives are shifting. And there was something else that I wanted to say about this. I think thinking about it as as reliability, is this person reliable or not, is probably the least interesting thing you can do. But you also have to think of the production of these narratives, especially if they've been published and republished over time, as something that is other than some kind of individual voice, voicing some unchanging individual interiority. You know, here is where I guess this is another place I'd pick a fight with Li Xiaojiang if I could. Any narrative that gets published has been through a process. You know, there's the person giving the interview, there's the person listening to the interview, there's the person transcribing the interview, there's the person editing it for publication, there's the person introducing it, there's the person grouping it with other interviews. You can look at it and say, oh, that means it's under so many layers of crud, I can't get at the person's original voice. Or you can look at it and say, this is a kind of group project here. It has to be seen as a kind of ensemble project. What work are each of those contributors doing? You know, Xiaoxian once said to me that she was much less interested than I was in like reading accounts of speeches from the archives that labor models had given in the 1950s. And she said, you know why I'm not interested? Because most of these women spoke these narratives. They did not write them. And they were written down by members of the Women's Federation. And then they were edited by members of the Women's Federation. And so, you know, I think in some ways she kind of felt like it was like listening to herself talk. Or not her personally, but her fellow Women's Federation workers, you know, that it had been a kind of project to produce a certain kind of material for particular purposes, mainly to mobilize other women, and that what the labor model herself said was less, you weren't going to get to the core there. And so I started shifting my attention to, like, what did that whole process look like by which that account was produced for public consumption and circulation? And it seems to me you could do the same thing with these Hunan women. I don't know much about the conditions of the republication, but or how things change over time, but I would pay some attention to that and make it clear it's not about some kind of sterile exercise in textual analysis. It's about the ways in which the past is constantly in motion in negotiation with a present that needs a version of that past. So bring that process up where people can see it and think about it and analyze it and criticize it.
Thank you. That was very insightful. And also that ties to our next question by Angela Lee. I think some of the aspects is already answered. But Angela, do you want to raise your question about the gender of memory and the historical truths?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a question that I've been thinking about since I read The Gender of Memory years ago. If individual memories aren't a contaminated version of so-called historical truth, what is their place in history? Also, how has your research on gender and memory influenced the way that you think about your own life? Thank you.
I'm going to answer the second one first. I would be a really lousy oral history subject, you know. I mean, although when I think about how scrambled the past gets in my own head, and maybe in all of your heads, but it's going to get worse as your past gets longer. I just think it is amazing that the women that we interviewed were as absolutely coherent as they were. And I think it partly has to do with being in a situation where most communication at the village level for most of their lives was done through talking. And also for some of them, that especially the labor models, that at certain periods they had been asked to repeat themselves a lot, and so certain ways of presenting themselves had gotten solidified. But if you ask me to give you an account of my past, I mean, what you heard today is about the best I can do. Don't ask me too many more questions about it. Although, yeah, understanding myself as a historical product, I think, is a really important part of an ethical practice for any historian. But if individual memories aren't a contaminated version of so-called historical truth, what is their place in history? I mean, so-called historical truth, and I wrote about this in the Gender of Memory, we get to work with contaminated fragments. That's all there is to it. That's all we get. Archival documents are not somehow pure in a way that oral narratives are not. Archival documents were generated by and large by bureaucrats that were trying to report on what was going on in the local area in response to demands from Shangmian. This is not an innocent kind of an interaction. It's an action that's fraught with relations of political power. At the same time, almost any document, like almost any oral narrative, ends up telling you things that the writer or the speaker didn't necessarily intend you to know. And I'll just give you an example from something I just read, which was a forthcoming book by Fabio Lanza about the urban communes in Beijing during the Great Leap Forward. So urban communes, which were the time when all these housewives were recruited into small-scale factories. And the urban communes didn't last very long, but women being in these kind of ancillary, peripheral, lower paid factories, that did become a factor on the urban landscape and in the Chinese economy. He uses exclusively official documents, archival documents, these kinds of reports. And you look at them and they are absolutely bursting with, usually under the section of, remaining problems, the Venti section of this. They are absolutely bursting with what women wanted, what upset them, what their daily frustrations were, what they couldn't get, what they didn't like before the communes, what they didn't like during the communes, and what they didn't like when the communes were dissolved. And so is it a contaminated fragment because it's collected by the state and used to report from the local level to the higher levels? Absolutely. And can we learn a ton from it? In this case, specifically about what was happening as housewives were pulled into the economic apparatus? Absolutely. So same thing for oral narratives, every piece of this, you have to consider it as part of a kind of matrix, a kind of vibrating matrix of pieces. The pieces they keep being in interaction with each other. You try to bring them into interaction with each other, but they're never going to sit still and be uncomplicated. They're just not, so if you want that, probably being a historian is not, you should go look elsewhere because otherwise you'll just be frustrated.
Thank you, Professor Hershatter. The next question also related to the Gender of Memory. I guess people are really enthusiastic about the book and intrigued, and so am I. So the next question by Fan Mei Xia. Do you want to raise it yourself?
Sure. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you for sharing your experiences. It's really great to hear and talk. So I often grapple with the question of audience and responsibility. Questions such as, who am I writing this for and what good does it do to my participants? So I was struck by your dedication to not superimposing emotions on the woman you interviewed in Shanxi. And I was just wondering if you could share your thoughts on how to balance the responsibility of honoring participants' voices and experiences while also producing work that remains legible and meaningful and, I guess, acceptable within the academic discourse.
Yeah, well, I feel like I was very lucky in that way. First of all, the participants' voices and experiences were so mesmerizing that the possibility of constraining them to, you know, a little quotation here and there was just I was not attracted by that at all. On the other hand, if you've ever read an oral narrative interview transcript, you know that they're practically unreadable. I mean, people, you know, people wander around in their own heads and sentences wander around, and they are really hard to read. That's why I don't share the kind of fetishization of keeping the transcript exactly as it was. I don't want to put words in people's mouths. I don't put words in people's mouths. That is how I honor their words. I use a lot of their words. And as you know, in that book, at least in the English edition of it, instead of putting things in quotation marks or indenting blocks of quotations, which people I have found in reading and skimming often skip, I stuck them in there in italics so that people could understand this is a big part of this book, and you better listen to what this person has to say. But what the person had to say got somewhat selected and edited. I tried to do it in a way that stayed true to the spirit of what they'd been talking about, but, you know, leaving out if they're, you know, obviously yelling at their daughter-in-law who's listening outside the door in telling a story about how they were filial and current generations aren't filial. You know, I tried to present things in a way that it would be easy for a reader to take in through the eyes. Now, what I'm very lucky about is I wrote that book at a somewhat later stage of my career. So producing work that remains legible and meaningful within academic discourse, I actually didn't care, you know, and there is a way in which I mean, I understood myself as writing for an audience that wanted to understand something about rural Chinese experience and that didn't necessarily have a huge background because I wrote it in English. So the first readers were based usually outside China. But I also, if academics didn't like it, what were they going to do to me? You know, like my job was not on the line and so forth. And of course, that's a situation we are not in today, even if you are extremely tenured and old, because academia in this country is under a very particular kind of assault. And younger people who are trying to get jobs and keep jobs are very aware of limits on discourse. So I don't mean to trivialize that. I just mean to say that I was very lucky in the time and the stage of my career at which I was writing it. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So last question before we keep some time for the final remark. So Coral, would you like to raise your question on the endurance, the care, and the acts of remembering?
Yes, thank you so much. Hi, Professor Hershatter. I'm big admirer of your work. Thank you so much for sharing today. So my question is, for rural Chinese women, resistance often lies in darkness, such as in endurance, care, or acts of remembering. So how might we reinterpret these quiet and subtle gestures not as weakness, but as another way of making history?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great note on which to end. I think your answer is kind of embedded in the question. You know, thing one, open your eyes, open your ears, listen and pay attention to these things because they are harder to hear than some other forms of historical sources. And I think that includes, you know, collecting as many accounts as you can about the generation that immediately preceded you as feminist activists, because a lot of them spent time, you know, Wang Zheng has this phrase that stuck with me from one of her books about women in the Women's Federation working in an unfavorable environment inside the party state. I think that's what she was talking about. She said they just kept their heads down like farmers working through a spate of bad weather, figuring that at some point, the weather was going to get better. Or when I lived in China and initially in the line between what could be published and what couldn't, criticizing the immediate past, was moving all the time. People used to write what they called choti wenxue, literature you put in the drawer and you save it for later. So I think that is a practice we might all need to consider, do your work, prevent the stuff from getting lost, take a picture of the Smithsonian exhibits, and keep your head down, maybe lift it up when you need to and when it's useful to do so, but don't let that material get lost.
As we're doing United Proud Women, we're constantly collecting all these historical artifacts, also from Professor Hershatter as well, her own collection. So feel free to submit, and we'll work with professional press to get all of these preserved trying our best as possible. Now, the question back to Professor Hershatter, do you have any final words for fellow feminists or queer activists? And we don't want to use the word future because of, queer temporality and all of that. But what are your hopes and excitements nowadays as a scholar?
Well, I think the emergence of networks of people exemplified in some ways by your organization is a very important thing. And I hope you keep good records about both what is going on with you and about your interaction with the more with your immediate past. And I'm, we are in a very difficult time, but I'm very heartened by the fact that you exist, and very interested to see what you can accomplish.
Yes, we indeed will continue to exist and thrive, and together with all you amazing senior scholars. Thank you so much, Professor Hershatter, for your time today.
Thank you.
We'll release the YouTube recordings very soon. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending us.
You all are a great